Dr. Kabaso, you may proceed.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. Okay, sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for this very important and timely discussion regarding the relations between South Africa and the US. My name is Kabaso Kabwe from the African Center for the Study of the US here at Wits. This webinar is actually a partnership between the African Center for the Study of the US and Wits Alumni Relations Office. And I'll be your moderator this afternoon, and I'm honored to be joined by our esteemed speakers, who I'm going to introduce shortly to help us unpack this very important topic. To begin with, I would like to introduce Dr. Ngcetane-Vika, who is a lecturer at the Wits School of Governance, as well as an engagement tutor and assessor for the Women Leadership Development Program at the Oxford University's Said Business School. She has also penned a memoir titled Running with My Parents' Shadows, Traversing a Leadership Avalanche, which is an epiphany that depicts how she traversed life's challenges and leadership avalanches. She is also a corporate governance, leadership, and legal scholar specializing in international business law, as well as a researcher at the Global Center for Academic Research at the South Valley University. We also have Dr. Bob Wekesa, who is the director of the African Center for the Study of the US. He is also the interim coordinator for the Africa-US Universities Network, which includes African Studies programs. And he is also a lecturer in journalism and media studies here at Wits. Thank you so much again for joining us. We have about an hour, 30 minutes for this discussion. We'll have a Q&A session later in the session, so you are more than welcome to post your questions in the chat or in the Q&A box, and we'll get to them later. We are also interested in knowing where you're joining us from this afternoon, so if you don't mind, kindly post for us in the chat the city where you're joining us from, and that's just for our own keeping tabs. To begin with, I'll start broadly. Maybe I'll start with Dr. Thelela, who will begin by just giving us a broad overview of what she thinks. We all know that South Africa-US relations have not been the best for a while. And we know that also since the Trump administration, these relations have intensified and South Africa has been making quite some headlines. Dr. Thelela, do you mind just helping us? How would you characterize the current state of diplomatic and economic relations between South Africa and the US? What would you say are main areas of cooperation or friction?
Yes. Good afternoon, Dr. Kabaso and all our colleagues who have joined. Well, it could be good morning, good evening, depending where you're joining us from. I'm very, very delighted to be, sharing some reflections together with you. Well, as far as the bilateral relationships with South Africa and the United States, as we can see in the mainstream media, as we can see, it's really at a very difficult point, to say the least. You could even say that it's a fractured bilateral relationship, which is problematic at many levels. And I'm sure many of you have seen the recall, the ambassador of South Africa to the United States being returned home persona non grata. But even before that, you could see there's some difficulty in the relationship. And that difficulty has now transpired in many forms. You have seen the tariffs, although there's a bit of withhold. You have seen some political dynamics. The AfriForum, it would seem they have some access maybe to some members within the US government, and also the whole narrative that South Africa is in the space of genocide. In other words, against the white compatriots. So it's a very complex relationship, and how President Trump is also conducting that relationship. Sometimes you get to see, the kind of message through Twitter, X that is. So it is complicated. We can talk later how perhaps Africa can use its leveraging power to support South Africa if it can or it cannot, or what does this mean also for the G20? President Trump is not coming, and also the transfer of the G20 from South Africa to the United States. But it's just at a very, very low point. But it must be said, as I come to the conclusion, Doug, and also everyone else who's here, that the South African relationship with the US hasn't been perfect. If you're looking at the Ronald Reagan years during apartheid, there were difficulties. It was actually members of Congress and senators who would take a stance against apartheid when the government would have a different view, especially the relationship across the Atlantic, Reagan and also Thatcher in the United Kingdom. And also even during Biden's term, whilst you may say that the response has been muted, but Biden didn't visit South Africa and there were many talks around it. So it has been imperfect. Of course, now it has reached a very interesting point, to say the least.
Thank you, Doctor. Dr. Wekesa, I'll invite you to respond to the same question. And as you do, also just perhaps help us understand historically what has defined this relationship between the US and the SA, and in very brief terms, how we got here.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kabwe, and thank you, colleagues, for joining from, as I can see in the chat, from just about everywhere in the world. And I'll start off by casting these current developments in the geopolitical context. South Africa has been said to be a swing state. And so what is a swing state? A swing state is a country that is a leader in its own region. In this case, South Africa is a leader not just in the Southern Africa region, but continentally. It has one of the most functional economy, even though South Africans will always complain that the economy is not working well. It is the gateway to the continent. It is just a very solid politically, economically, and so forth on the continent. In fact, South Africa has played a crucial role on the continent in terms of setting the terms of engagement at the African Union level and so forth. So that's one perspective that makes it a swing state. And I think from the US side, given that the Trump administration is looking to make America great again, it has to kind of try to wither or to erode the power of other regional powers. And I think this then explains why South Africa is a target of the US from an overall overarching perspective before we even get into the details. And I think one also has to factor in the fact that Trump is not very interested in geopolitical formations such as the G20, which is South Africa is, South Africa is hosting the G20 summit this year. Trump has expressed almost something close to anger at the presence and the power that formations such as the BRICS are beginning to accumulate. In fact, when the BRICS nations talked of de-dollarization or doing their business in currencies other than the dollar, Trump, even as president-elect, mentioned that he would impose 100% tariffs on those countries. And of course, South Africa is a member of the BRICS. one of the original members of the BRICS, although the BRICS is now expanding. In fact, South Africa did host the BRICS summit not too long ago in August 2023. So I think the broad picture then suggests that, or actually indicates that South Africa is the crosshairs of the current US administration for being a leader on the continent, part of the emerging powers, Brazil, Russia, India, China, a country that gives voice to the continent in many multilateral, formations and structures. I think that's an important point to overall point out, because we have heard, and I think this is true, that the world is going through some change. Global order is shifting. The geopolitical formation of the world is changing. People have talked of the global majority, mostly African, Indian, China, where the largest populations of the world lie. And so this is broadly the context under which the relations have been very fractious between the US and South Africa. Dr. Kabwe, you asked me to also provide a brief historical background. I think my colleague, Dr. Thelela, did mention the relations during apartheid. I wouldn't want to go way back there, but in the very recent times, there have been a couple of instances, even during the Biden administration, that have indicated fractious relations between South Africa and the US. One was the fact that in late 2022, South Africa engaged with Russia and China in naval practices or naval exercises on the Indian Ocean. This then indicated that South Africa prefers engagement with China and Russia when it comes to military powers. And as you know, power is almost sometimes vested in matters military. In 2023, we saw the incident where the former US ambassador to South Africa, Ruben Brigetti, a scholar in fact, claimed that South Africa was transferring weapons onto a ship near Cape Town destined for Russia. And that is in the context of the Russia-Ukraine war. We know the position that South Africa took on the Ukraine war, which was non-alignment, but which was seen as alignment towards Russia rather than true non-alignment. In the more recent times, we've seen South Africa take Israel to the International Court of Justice, and in fact, eventually to the ICC, the International Criminal Court. And of course, as we know, in global alliances, Israel and the US are very close. So I think the claim from the US was that South Africa is in fact aligned with Hamas, where the Palestinian interests are concerned. And of course, South Africa has also forged relations with countries that are considered enemies of the US, like Iran, and of course, Iran is really a big major player in the Middle East geopolitics. So I think this broad overview presents the global picture of where the tensions lie and perhaps where solutions should be sought. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was quite detailed. Colleagues, I would also just like to mention that the session is being recorded, and a recording will be shared to everyone who's present here, and even those that registered but for some reason are not able to join us today. So the recording will be shared, and it will also be available on YouTube after this. Maybe now I would just like to move to Dr. Thelela. We just heard this week, actually, that the president has appointed a special envoy to the US to hopefully try and restore relations. These really soured relations. How do you think Trump's policies, the many policies that some of which you have highlighted, cutting aid, expelling our previous ambassador, how do you think these have obviously impacted the already sour relations between the two countries? But also, how do you see our new special envoy to the US hopefully restoring these relations?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Kabaso. And to build on my colleague, Dr. Rob, I think he has located the dynamics very well before I respond to the Mr. Ngcetane-Vika's appointment as a special envoy. That where we are seated, colleagues, we're seated at the contestation between multilateralism and nationalist interest that we have seen. There's an uptake, not only in the United States, by the way, but you see that in Europe. You also see it here in South Africa and other parts of the world. So the Trump presidency finds its term, at least the second one, not that the first one didn't have elements of this, within that really heightened global space. And South Africa and the ground has been really set very well in the context here by my colleague, Dr. Rob, the position of South Africa within the continent, the position of South Africa within the global south, especially with the BRICS, and really the acceleration and also expansion of the membership of BRICS, which could be seen as an alternative to the Western hegemonies that we have been seeing the past centuries or so. So to answer Mr. Mcebi's appointment finds itself within that. But maybe the question is that why did the president opt for a special envoy than an ambassador? Because there's a difference between a special envoy and an ambassador. And I'm not obviously privy to the president's thoughts, but my suspicion is that the effectiveness of a special envoy, especially at the backdrop of your own, the past ambassador being a non grata, given the comments that he had made that were seen not to be palatable to the United States president, that Jonas would be given a specific missions, because special envoys in the main are for that. And I suspect that the aim is to really find a way of navigating this very fractured relationship. How do we try to slowly come closer, especially that we're faced with, of course, the ICJ matter, as Dr. Rob has mentioned, it's still before the courts. How do we navigate that as South Africa, given the close relationship between the United States and Israel, and also our own foreign policy, which is based on non-alignment? And of course, there's Russia-Ukraine dynamics there also in the picture. How does that work for us? I mean, also matters even before the United Security Council, and of course AGOA, of course the multipolar world that the United States, especially under the presidency of President Trump, may be seeing it as an attack to the United States, that kind of thing. So it's a very difficult space that Mr. Mcebi is finding himself in. One can only trust that there's work that is happening in the background. President is doing the work that presidents ought to do, lobby, try to really give some ground to Mr. Mcebi's work. Otherwise, I think it's going to be difficult, especially that I saw 2 days ago a video that he spoke about President Trump, some comments, I think it was 2020, 2021. And I was thinking to myself, oh boy, this may not land well. But who knows? He's an astute businessman, Mr. Mcebi. He's a very astute politician, a very experienced politician. Maybe he will find ways of navigating such that we're coming closer to each other. And South Africa feels a level of pressure, especially with G20. In few months. What does this mean? And G20 is not only that it's sitting it will be on the African soil for the first time. In other words, South Africa should be pushing the agenda of the continent. But will President Trump come? Especially that Marco Rubio didn't come for, the ministers, foreign affairs ministers. What does this mean? It's even more complicated because we should be handing over the G20 chairmanship to the United States for 2026. So Mcebi Jonas will have to navigate. So it's not only on trade relations. Of course, those are important, but you also need that relationship to be at least cordial, finding each other. not necessarily agreeing on everything, but are they able to find each other? Well, we'll all be waiting and see what will happen. I'm really waiting. I'm interested to see. I'm intrigued, actually. I can't wait to see.
Thank you so much. You've ended at a very good note, because I would like to ask Dr. Wekesa. We've talked about the G20. Of course, it's coming to Africa for the first time. And like Dr. Thelela rightly mentioned, we're supposed to hand over the leadership to South Africa. Help us by just painting a picture for us. What does this look like? We're supposed to hand over to the US, and at the moment, the relations are not at their best. We hope for the best. What do you think may happen if our efforts do not go as intended to make these relations better? How does the handover look like in 2026? The G20 handover.
No. Thank you, Dr. Kabaso, and I want to associate myself with the comments made by my colleague Thelela. I think there's room for optimism, but I think I'd rather take the pessimistic view here, even though I really want to say we are hopeful that President Trump will come over, that Mark Rubio and State Department in the US will come to the table as regards the G20. I just take it from the point of view of the Trump administration's approach to multilateralism as an indication that it's almost a no-brainer that the US is not coming to the G20 hosted in Johannesburg for the first time and on the African soil. I say this because, of course, some of the very first acts, executive orders by President Trump were to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, to withdraw from World Health Organization, to withdraw funding to United Nations Refugee Commission, I think it's called, and essentially gutting the US's involvement in the world governing body called the United Nations. Now, if the US has withdrawn from the UN generally, what is the G20 to Trump? I think he will trump it very quickly. He will trash it, as it were. In any case, a follow-up point is that the main work of the G20 is reform of financial governance. That is really the core. Of course, the diplomacy and foreign policy related issues follow, but the G20 was established after the collapse of, after the financial crisis, the Asian crisis of the late 90s and the 2007-2008 financial crisis, to kind of stabilize currencies, to stabilize global trade, and so forth. This year, South Africa itself has crafted the theme of equality, inclusivity, and diversity. These are terms that Trump does not want to hear at all, or the Trump administration. So they sound like DAI already. And in fact, the Trump administration has said as much, that South Africa is DAI on steroids. So on the basis of the theme alone, I don't see them coming. Given those circumstances, I imagine that the best the US will do, as they did during the recent Foreign Affairs and Finance Ministers meeting, would be to send a junior officer. I mean, in this particular case, it was a Shajedi Affairs, who in fact resigned shortly after those meetings in Cape Town. So I think, of course, let's just get back to the very bottom of this. America under Trump is decidedly for America first, isolationism. The G20 does not speak to that policy agenda. Remember that Trump actually signed the America First policy as the first executive order, not second or third, the very first one. So I think we can be prepared to do the G20 without the US, and perhaps then therefore rely more on partnership with the European Union. The EU and European nations have generally indicated their interest in working with South Africa. And of course, South Africa can also rely on its BRICS partners. And that would be my take on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doc. Dr. Thelela, I also want to just bring in the BRICS expansion and South Africa's role in the BRICS, which has been seen as a challenge to US influence. What would you say are the potential, or not even potential, current risks, benefits for South Africa in engaging in, strengthening ties with China, Russia, Iran, which the US does not particularly like? And how do you see Trump's administration viewing this, shifts and all these things? Thank you.
Yes. You see, the space of geopolitics, I always say this in my class, the classes I teach, it's a messy space, very messy. And if you understand that messiness of it, you won't be surprised when you realize Saudi Arabia could be part, perhaps, of the BRICS, whilst having a relationship with the United States. Nor would you be shocked to see that maybe President Trump, for instance, is trying to form some cordiality of some kind with Russia, especially on the matter of Russia-Ukraine, and maybe even trade relations. So when you look at BRICS, it would be very harmful if we're looking at BRICS as the ultimate, and with no proper reflections on its complexities on its own. Who's the leader of BRICS, for instance? Because if you are looking at the Western powers, the United States is known to be the leader of the free world. Now we are creating BRICS, which is very important for the global South. Make no mistake, creating a multipolar world. There is an alternate from the Western powers. And South Africa being the first member in Africa, and a critical member, as Dr. Bob has alluded to, comes with challenges. Because where does South Africa sit strategically within BRICS? Some have been saying in the public discourse, we must cut our ties with the United States. We don't need them. We can survive on its own. Well, the global world is so interconnected that we need each other for better, sometimes for worse, and the latter is not the ideal. But to expect that BRICS would be a bloc that would resolve all the trade problems within the global South, it's probably not very realistic, but it's important. Because what you will notice, even the BRICS members will still continue to trade with the United States. And what about using a different currency? That is not the dollar. The United States won't like that, but members of BRICS would like that. But what I'm also thinking is going to happen over time with BRICS, who's going to be the sort of a clear leader of the BRICS? Is it going to be Russia? Is it going to be China? What would be the determination? Maybe it will be China, because China economically is coming just after the United States. So South Africa's role there would be more of using soft power, if you like, trying to navigate the dynamics within BRICS, because the United States is already feeling alienated by just the formation of the BRICS. And so South Africa must navigate, and especially that not all African countries are already members of the BRICS. So South Africa has got a moral responsibility. And I know the critique that is always there. South Africa thinks that they are special, they are big brothers or big sisters. They are not big brothers or big sisters. But sometimes we need to be strategic. If one of us is sitting in these global powers, they must advocate for agendas of the continent. And perhaps that's where then South Africa can also find a way of leveraging the African Continental Free Trade Agreement within the broader BRICS agreements, trade agreements. Maybe it's one way of being that voice of the continent, that there's already a trade agreement within the continent. Maybe how do we then, as BRICS members, navigate around that? So it must be a very soft power, navigating it, continuously navigating it. Otherwise, they will continue to irritate the West, and not only the United States, but also some of those who are not necessarily for BRICS. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Doc. Dr. Wekesa, just on the same point, on how South Africa would navigate its, strategic positioning while trying to maintain autonomy. We have seen global power competition. We see it currently playing out now between the US and China. We've also seen increased Russia's engagement in Africa, and all these close allies to South Africa. Maybe just your few comments as well on how South Africa can just navigate this strategic position it has, noting that also South Africa has its own unique, foreign policy and its commitments to human rights and other things that guide its foreign policy engagements.
Thank you. I think I'll start off from where my colleague, Dr. Thelela, has left, which is that, in fact, actually to her first point, the geopolitical world, the world of multilateralism, is a messy one. I want to agree. And I think that's the whole reason for having ambassadors. In this case, the special envoy, Jonas, working with South African ambassadors to the WTO, to the AU, to China, to India. It might appear that Minister or now envoy Jonas is going to DC or will be focusing on Washington, DC, but he has to coordinate with colleagues in China, Russia, India, and so forth, so that the country can speak with one voice on these matters. And I think I say that with hindsight. I think we started off by observing that our former ambassador, Ibrahim Rasool, was kicked out of the US because he actually blundered, in my opinion, because he went into a situation in which the US was just waiting for an opportunity for someone to make a comment like the one he made of global white, of South Africa being, the US being a global white supremacist kind of promoter. It's not far from the truth, actually. But I think President Trump, Minister Marco Rubio were waiting for just that moment. And it presented itself, and they did that. Number two, the person that the US has nominated to be US ambassador to Pretoria is Leo Brent Bossel, who is a well-known, okay, I'm not an ambassador, so I can always just say he's a white supremacist or something close. I think that's how he has been described. So in those circumstances, anytime South Africa seems to be very close to the BRICS, it risks its relations with the US. And we cannot necessarily just dismiss the US because, look, the trade volume between South Africa and the US is 20 billion. And it's largely in favor of South Africa. From citrus fruits exporters to critical minerals to automobiles, South Africa is one of the few African countries that exports, finished products to the US. So you want to, on the one hand, chart a relation with the global South nations, but at the same time, you cannot dismiss the US. You can look at the effect of the cut in USAID funding that supported HIV and anti-malaria, medication. In fact, this is one of the few executive orders that has been directed at a specific country, South Africa. So I think it will be a very kind of, fine line to pursue for the ambassador and for South Africa broadly. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Before we move on, Dr. Thelela, just maybe your quick comments, because and also colleagues, you're welcome to post your questions in the chat. We'll get to them. So if you have any question, please post them in the chat and we'll have a Q&A session shortly. There are many people that feel, Dr. Thelela, that, South Africa is bearing the brunt of, the Trump's executive orders and so forth, mostly for one decision it took. You mentioned this, but maybe just to take you back, the ICJ case against Israel. How much of this do you say is really angered the US? What is your comment? And
yes.
Come in, because as Dr. Wekesa mentioned, many people say, you can't, the South African government tries to have, a positive trade and cultural relationship with the US on one hand, and on the other hand, is cultivating very close relations with the US rivals. So what is your take on that?
Well, it's for everyone to see that evidently the ICJ matter really irritated the US. This is why it's important to give a historical context, because it's not only the Trump administration.
Mm-hmm.
Even during Biden's time, Dr. Bob, I think you were alluding to this too. During Biden's time, the Secretary of State, they were dismissing South Africa's case before the ICJ. So, even President Biden himself. So I wouldn't even, on this particular matter, locate it only with President Trump. It's just because Israel is one of the closest allies of the United States. They were dismissive. So the response was really that of rebuttal, and it was public. It was for all to see. There's nothing in this case, innuendos to the effect that maybe there's no substance behind it. But the legal team of South Africa proved them, because really they argued the case. So there is no doubt about it. The ICJ case is really a thorn in the relationship between South Africa and the United States. And the question one ought to be asking is that, how does Ngcetane-Vika navigate that? It's going to be difficult, because are you saying that drop the case from the ICJ? What would be expected to warm the relationship? And if that's the question asked of the South African government, what would that mean for South Africa's foreign policy, which is non-alignment, which has always been seen to be really pro-Palestinians? So I just don't know, but I know for a fact that it's one of the reasons. Well, other people are arguing that even the presence of Elon Musk, or the proximity of Elon Musk to the president of the United States, is also a challenge on its own. You can debate it. I really don't know. But I'm looking at the ICJ as one of those that really, 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 really have put a strain on the relationship. And the approach and the responses have been both direct and indirect. Cutting off the aid. And then the ambassador, because as Dr. Rob had said rightly, I was in the US at that time when that saga with the ambassador happened. And I was of the view that they were waiting for this moment. It was, when people are waiting for you to say something, and Ngcetane-Vika is going to be walking that tightrope, because every word he utters, every reflections he makes, will be on spotlight. We can only wish him the best. I do.
Yeah. While I still have you, we've seen now that, President Trump has been, imposing tariffs. We have a 30% tariff, although now there's the 90-day pause. How do you see this further escalating tensions between the two countries and impacting trade agreements like AGOA? Is there even a future for AGOA for South Africa?
Well, with the imposition of the tariffs, by extension, AGOA is already problematic for South Africa, because some people have been saying that, oh no, AGOA is still on the table. No. If you go and read the tariffs, AGOA is already almost off the table. Perhaps what you could be asking for clarity, which maybe it's a rhetorical statement, is that because AGOA was due to be renewed end of September, October, somewhere there. So are we given maybe time until then, or is it immediate? But it brings a critical point. Obviously, Dr. Rob has spoken on the impact on the trade. Some of the agreements we have with the United States. But for me, it also raises a critical question, nexus question, that perhaps as Africans we need to reflect on. Now that South Africa finds itself in this position, and AGOA was not only for the benefit of South Africa, what is the reflection of other African countries? Is it going to be a muted response, protecting their own interest? What is even the response of the AU? Can AU use this moment to say, well, we would want to trade as a bloc with the United States, as Africa, like Europe does? Because if you were observing, Europe was speaking in one voice, and there's value in that one voice. But in Africa, I don't need to tell you about the dynamics within the continent. I was asking myself, how does an AU come to this discourse? And how do African countries, the rest of the continent, look at this moment of South Africa and the United States, especially the impact on AGOA? How do they relate with it? Do they see it as a South African problem? Find, implications on trade relations between the United States and South Africa, and it's really not their interest? Or can it be a rallying point for Africans? And then maybe then the principles of Pan-Africanism can really direct us in how we deal with this moment. I really don't know, but I was just thinking that beyond AGOA and the challenges Africa finds itself, because obviously the impact is immediate. Somebody was telling me about the aid, just on AIDS, the immediate impact, because the money is not flowing, and you're talking about people's lives. They need medication. And the list is endless. And others are arguing that cut ties with the United States, you can survive on your own. Well, I'm sure you can debate that with everybody else, whether do we have adequate resources to do so or not. I would love an independent Africa, but this moment right now, we are not yet there. So how do we deal with the challenges of tariffs and others in the United States? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Thelela. You highlighted something very important and something that we are continuously discussing and engaging in. African agency, what should be the response of Africans? Where is that collective African voice? And before, Dr. Wekesa, before you come in on this very important one, I would also like you to just weigh in on this point, but from the opposite angle. We've heard so much about the economic consequences, say, for South African businesses and all these tariffs that the Trump administration has imposed. To what extent do you think these US foreign policy shifts are also affecting American investment, business interests, and trade flows with South Africa? So what do they stand to lose?
Thanks, Dr. Kabwe. No, you are absolutely right. I think you realize that at the height of the tariffs that were issuing one after the other from White House about 2 weeks ago or 1.5 weeks back, ultimately the U.S. Financial markets stumbled, and business people are up in arms. Hence the 90-day pause. This actually then applies not just to US trade and economic relations with all the other countries in the world, but also to South Africa, US relations. And I'll give you a quick example. The automobile companies, car manufacturers in South Africa, mostly American, General Motors, Ford, John Deere, and a couple of others. So these are American companies operating from South African soil for various factors. One is access to raw materials, much cheaper labor, and so forth. So if you impose tariffs, uniform tariffs and differentiated tariffs, you're actually hitting American companies themselves. And if you extrapolated this to the fact that there are 600 US businesses registered under the American Chamber of Commerce. These are 600 solid companies. And this is before you even mention other companies that are not registered, American companies that are not registered with the American Chamber of Commerce. So these companies have set up in South Africa, in the special economic zones, in the Gauteng, industrial parks and so forth. Many of them are into pharmaceutical manufacturing, are in the IT sector, are in the hospitality sector, and so forth. These are actually then American companies that report their profits in the US that will then be negatively impacted. But having said that, one then has to look at what options beyond that South Africa has in this shifting multipolar world. I think a very key point that has arisen recently is that countries such as South Africa and others have to move towards self-reliance, to kind of shift away from dependency on, for example, PEPFAR for HIV/AIDS and so forth. Of course, someone can say it is too drastic. The gap left by the aid card is too deep for the South African economy to, overcome. But we have to be very clear in our minds that this money, it looks like it's very unlikely to come back in the next 4 years, at least to the end of the Trump administration. So you must have a plan B. And this particular case, it is self-reliance based on tightening the budgets, based on shifting around priorities to meet, for example, what my colleague mentioned, Dr. Thelela mentioned, the people that are, at the risk of death because of lack of access to antiretrovirals or other kinds of medication. And it will then suggest that you have to have a lean government because, South African government is considered one of the largest in the world, one of the best paid as well. You have to think of, civil servants taking a haircut, as it were. You have to think of where, areas where you can reduce your wage bill and, stuff like that to fit in the current gap. And I think finally, I do also associate with myself with the excellent point made by my colleague that Africans are better off engaging with the United States as one under, for example, the African Continental Free Trade Area. Because even as South Africa is a major economy, is a major regional power, it's still a very small power when you look at it, globally. I mean, its economy is in the 20s if you look at the rankings and so forth. So it needs to hedge together the other African countries so that it can present a united voice that is bigger than itself. Now, the challenge there, and this is then goes to the African Union, will be that the Washington, the current Trump administration is all for bilateralism rather than multilateralism, meaning that the African Union, working with South Africa and individual countries, will have to have a very compelling case for engagement with the US as one, rather than as individual countries, for example, through free trade areas and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Doc. I was actually going to ask you the role of, say, the AU in helping to balance the trade relations, not just trade anyway, the relations between South Africa and the US. But you rightly put it that the challenge is that the US prefers bilateral relations compared to, the whole multilateral and multilateralism. I would just like to move now, Dr. Thelela, on, global governance. You mentioned this in the opening. We know that South Africa is on record pushing for global governance reforms, reform of the multilateral system. How do you see this further alienating it from the US? Or do you see it creating some new diplomatic opportunities?
Thank you so much. I was still enjoying listening to Dr. Rob there. Thank you so much. Obviously, in an ideal global space, global order, pursuing global governance reforms is ideal. Right? It should be a noble cause that we all should be embracing because we are living in a very interconnected global, the international order really. I don't think we're going to go back to where we were more individualistic. However, elections matter, governments matter. And this is why we're seeing now this tension between exactly what Dr. Rob was saying about multilateralism versus nationalist interest. And it would seem countries like the United States and some in Europe and other parts of the world are preferring a more, make Europe great and Europe first and those kind of things. So we're sitting there. And South Africa can continue playing that role. Remember, it carries some a moral weight of some kind, having been, having a not a seamless transition to democracy, but at least the one that didn't lead to a bloody civil war. So there are some lessons for transitional democracies all over the world. We're known for being a human rights kind of a country, notwithstanding problems we see, sometimes the failings of government that really then lead to failings of the human rights. So they can continue to do that. And there are a number of things that they can do, amongst others. For instance, the climate change. It's one of those. But unfortunately, the current administration in the United States is not likely to be warm towards that. And what does that mean for just energy transition in South Africa, especially that the Biden administration had promised to make a contribution towards the transition from coal. So you see the change of governments, the impact in terms of policy shifts, that they impact also the bilateral relations. South Africa can continue to use the G20 presidency to advocate for a more global reforms in bodies like the United Nations, the Security Council. I mean, you see how the dynamics there, that people can sit other member states and they decide, and then those who've got the veto powers, and then they come and veto a decision. So it can still try to play that. And also South Africa is known for sort of trying to resolve conflicts, global conflicts. We're seeing an uptick in wars, obviously. It uses forms of negotiations, diplomacy. Let's talk, let's resolve other than going to war. And whether that it's effective in Russia, Ukraine, I don't know. You will tell me. And then the matter in the ICJ, it's a totally different ball game. But collaborations to resolve global conflicts remains an important responsibility that they can try to push. But when you have a major power like the United States taking certain positions, it complicates many things. And I think South Africa is trying to navigate that. I'm glad I'm not the president of South Africa. He must be having sleepless nights. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Doc. Dr. Wekesa, just looking at future prospects, given the broader African geopolitical landscape, how do you see South Africa positioning itself to protect its national interests, of course, especially when we refer to, say, it's the land policy that the Trump administration seemingly takes exception to? That is, something that the South African government, I would like to imagine, is keen to see through. How do you see then South Africa navigating such national interests at the same time trying to engage constructively with Washington?
Thanks, Dr. Kabwe. In fact, I'll just build on what you said, which suggests that, and of course, I've been reading some comments in the chat, and I can see some colleagues are like, we are done with the US. Let's just call their bluff. We do not need to deal with the US. And some colleagues are actually saying, no, look, South Africa should not lessen its relations with China, also in the chat. You can see these are two polars. I think South Africa has to be careful at this point in time to navigate the relations as the title of the talk suggests, in the sense that, the truth be said, South Africa is not yet a global power. So it has to figure out how to negotiate, and this now calls for high-level diplomatic skills, to negotiate with the US, to negotiate with the Europeans, to be a leader on the continent, to continue engaging with China, and to do a balancing act for now. One day, I don't know how many years from now, when South Africa wields power like the Chinese or the Americans, it can afford to take a more radical, a more drastic position. In fact, if we just focus on the word positioning yourself, South Africa should position itself in an eclectic kind of changing global order, global world order. In fact, because this international order has not really changed completely as it is now, it's just in the dynamics of changing, meaning that I know that there are colleagues from the political class, from the academic class, intellectuals, and so forth, who would rather that we ally ourselves with one side, say the global south, against the global north. And some will say, no, look, you have to remain committed to the values of democracy, human rights, and so forth, which are Western or global north values. I think my sense is that President Ramaphosa, his cabinet, and other people involved in this would rather focus on navigating the relations with all parties. And in fact, that is the notion of non-alignment, as it were. Number two, I think there's an opportunity, even with the current fractious relations with the US, for South Africa to invest in people-to-people relations. I'm thinking, for example, of the religious, the black churches have very close links with their South African counterparts. The evangelicals, you might be not quite an evangelical yourself, like I am not, but there are connections at that point. University to university relations. Here at Wits alone, as I'm sure many colleagues know, we have relations with Harvard, with Yale, with the University of Southern California, and so forth. And these relations can continue. Then, of course, the business to business relations. We have the South Africa-US Business Council. We have the American Chamber of Commerce. I think relations can continue at that level, even as formal official relations are pursued. So I think in my final comment on this particular point, I think the idea that we can dismiss the US and embrace China fully, or otherwise, or the reverse, might, in my opinion, not be the best of South African interest at this point in time. And I'm sorry if I'm being too careful. This is very boring stuff, but I sense that we have to walk the tightrope, as my colleague Thelela said earlier. Thank you.
Thank you. I would just like to see some questions from the chat and see if I can pick some. There's one. I'm sorry if I'm not able to read or mention who posted the question, but I'll just go ahead and read some. South Africa-China relations, what is the wisdom of moving the Taiwan embassy to Johannesburg at the insistence of China? South Africa must stop being a vessel of China the same way it's refusing to be bullied by the US. Where do you see South Africa's position in the new order? These are two different questions that I picked from the chat. Doc, maybe you might want to comment on the first one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, they are related. The fact that it's at the is it instruction? Is instruction the right word? Or at the request of China? That on its own is going to create irritation on the other side of the Atlantic. It must also be said that every country has got its own interests. I traveled to Cairo sometime last year, and they are building what they call New Cairo. Every building was literally, sort of, you could see that China is investing heavily here. But what I also noted was that you also see a lot of Chinese working in this development. And why am I raising that? Sometimes when we talk about Russia-China relationship with South Africa, which are quite relatively healthy, we think that they are perfect. And hence people don't understand. Some were asking me in some session, but if we've got a good relationship historically with Russia, and Russia seems to be warming up nicely to President Trump, why President Trump is not speaking on our behalf? And I was like, whose behalf? You're a member state, South Africa, you're a member state, you've got your interest. Russia has got its own interest. Of course, having alliances within the global community is good, it's important. So if it's at the instruction of China, so you know who you will already irritate. And the second question was?
Where do you see South Africa's position in the new order?
The international order.
Yes.
We're still finding out. It's evolving. And I think South Africa will continue with its foreign policy on a serious note of non-alignment. I think they're going to be sitting there for some time. But also remember, when you're talking about South Africa's space in the sort of the evolving global order, South Africa is challenged internally. It still has its own GNU dynamics. And within that family of GNU, the 10 political parties, you've got some more right-leaning in terms of ideology, and ANC sometimes sitting at more centrist, in my view, than the left that it used to be. So South Africa, the one that you're talking about a more complex South African political landscape. Even within the GNU, they don't even agree on the foreign policy, which route to take. If you were to ask the DA now whether we should continue with the ICJ case matter or not, I suspect that you'll get a different answer if you were to ask the ANC. So, talking South Africa with its own complexities, it's navigating that space whilst it's still finding itself within the GNU, because it's no longer one voice, it's multiple voices, different interests, sometimes competing, sometimes conflicting interests, but we're moving right along, aren't we?
Yeah, thank you so much. Dr. Wekesa, I would like you to take this one. Your comments on the duties and role of diplomats who must practice diplomacy, emphasis on diplomacy. And I think this question is, in relation to the events leading up to the dismissal of our previous ambassador. And there's also another similar question in the chat on the matter of diplomatic approach to avoid irritating the US and Western interests. The benefit of taking this path seems to be to bring diminishing impact. So maybe just your comments on the issues of diplomacy and diplomatic approach to the US, as well as the duties and roles of diplomats, the diplomats we appoint to represent us.
Certainly. In fact, you've touched on it already. I think the number one role of a diplomat is representing their country in the receiving state. And then other roles can follow. But basically, as you know that, the ambassador is actually called ambassador plenipotentiary, meaning that he is representative of the president of that country on behalf of the country at large. So that being said, the ambassador who goes to Washington, of course, they have leverage at some point to negotiate as best as they can on the basis of their relations and so forth. But they should never veer too far away from the policy of the sending country, in this case, South Africa. And as they say, the term that has been used, the phrase that has been used often is all politics is local. This actually applies to diplomacy in some sense. All the representation has to be based on the foreign policy at home, taking into account the interests at the national level. And I suspect at this point in time, South African interests, I think they are actually stated in the foreign policy frameworks, are actually to kind of boost South Africa's economic development, and then other matters multilateral can follow, because South Africa wants to draw in resources to develop its economy, to increase beneficiation from its minerals and so forth. So I think that will be key. I think the second point is the role of the diplomat is also to look at the receiving state's environment, operation environment. And I think at this point in time, the US is a risky posting for any diplomat or envoy. Because everything you do is subject to America first. And the possibility that you will be kicked out is always on the cards. So given that, I think there's a need for investment in intelligence gathering, kind of finding the right interlocutors within the US government, who are the right people, even within the Republican Party, in the Senate, in Congress, and who are the right people in the business community. I think we've all heard over and over again that President Trump is transactional. Fortunately, the new envoy has a finance background as well as being an executive director at MTN. So he will know one or two things about transactions. So how do you, on what basis do you transact with whom, including even maybe Elon Musk, as it were? I think the next other aspect is soft power, which is an important aspect of diplomacy. Basically soft power and public diplomacy, because even as the relations might be very tricky and slippery at the official level, as I mentioned earlier, South Africa is, in fact, of all African countries, it's one country that has very deep connections with the US at individual, institutional, business, and so forth levels. And finally, I think we could go on and on. One has to also take into account the fact that some states in the US, of the about 51 states, some states are actually under the Democratic Party. I'm thinking the federal seat of government, Washington, D.C. itself, New York, Los Angeles, that's basically California, as it were. So there's this concept of state-to-state relations that I think I saw in the chat of my colleague Benji, who works in that area. State or provincial, we'll call them provincial diplomacy in South Africa, but state-to-state relations, I mean, that's based on the states in the United States. Those can actually proceed, and there's an opportunity there. In a nutshell, the ambassador has to kind of walk the narrow and straight, at the same time be very creative and innovative in his approach, given that he is representing the US not in a Biden administration, or not between South Africa and, say, Nigeria, where the relations might be tricky, but quite conventional, but in a very tricky kind of circumstance. Thank you.
Thank you so much. As I'm still looking at the questions in the chat, I see some questions related to trade and AGOA, and I think there's a general consensus that trade with Global South, BRICS nations offer more opportunities, as well as development financing, and that there may be alternatives, and we don't need a begging syndrome from the US. And I would also like to read this question. If SA is to negotiate other multilateral trade deals, how long does it take to complete a deal? Obviously, we won't be allowed to export products to China for which they produce internally. So what are some of the low-hanging fruits in terms of international trade deals? Can we strike a deal with SADC, especially under the procurement protocol, where all 16 countries agree to collectively purchase medical products from countries like China? In this context, can SADC agree to purchase medicals, etc., should China establish manufacturing facilities? Doc, which one would like to go first? Just the issue of
yes.
Yeah.
I mean, the one on trading amongst ourselves is what we should have been doing all along. Mm-hmm. That's how I would answer that question. Because if you want to achieve self-reliance, self-determination amongst others, the first thing we should have done is to trade really extensively amongst ourselves, and we don't do that. One of my recent work I did through the law school in Liverpool is actually doing a comparison between the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and the European Union, that single market. And one of the things that became very, very clear as I was conducting the study is that we are reluctant traders amongst ourselves. So you're not going to achieve self-reliance and overly independence and dependence amongst each other as Africans until you are intentional to do so. So the simple answer, it's supposed to be a yes. Well, I can't answer how long will a trade deal between a particular country and another one would take, because there are a number of dynamics often in between that. But that we should be doing. And we already have a vehicle, the African Continental Free Trade Area, ratified in 2018. But how much are we even utilizing that vehicle as a rallying point for us, for the African intertrade, regional trade? And let alone you're looking at ECOWAS, of course, the different regional blocks within the continent, looking at ECOWAS in the West, in spite of its dynamics, and also looking at SADC, us, and also North Africa and East. So it doesn't matter the dynamics, but that's where we should be going, in my view. But until there's political will, because often you notice that African countries trade sometimes more with their former colonizers than they do amongst themselves, which is a question for another day. That why are we still sitting there? And I don't want to be, I want to be careful here, but I'm asking that question as you're also asking it yourselves. And of course, there are also issues of security within the continent, because trade also must exist. It thrives in a peaceful environment. Because, I mean, we are seeing some challenges already now in Sudan and others in Eastern DRC and. So we also need to really still sit there. So I've answered it. We should be trading amongst ourselves at heightened scale. So we should be asking our politicians, why is not happening?
Yeah. Thank you. Dr. Wekesa, I'll throw these two questions to you. Maybe just your comments, actually. The tenor of this conversation is that multilateralism is the way to go. It would seem obvious, however, that it would simply crystallize conflicts between major powers and sideline everyone else under the flag of one or the other. So your thoughts on that? And then also, President Donald Trump wants to create, maintain, and sustain a new global order and make America great again. What are your comments on that, especially on maintaining and sustaining a new global order, not necessarily what we're seeing or what we have seen in the past?
Right. No, thanks, Dr. Kabwe. I think first of all, to the question of multilateralism versus unilateralism, I think this question also has to be paired with the fact of a terminology that we've come to use quite a bit, which is that we are living in a multipolar world.
Yeah.
And I think this is what has triggered Trump's approach to America First, to return us to a unipolar world where the US is the sole superpower, which is, I don't think it's going to be possible at this point in time. There are just so many powers that regional powers, as we've mentioned. South Africa is a power in its region, even if it's a small power globally. I don't think we are going to roll back the fact that China is now the biggest manufacturer of electric vehicles. It's a power in renewable energy. I mean, it has no competitor, China, that is. In things like shipbuilding, which then suggests it's a naval power as well. China has the biggest, army, the People's Liberation Army is in physical, boots on the ground. So and then of course Japan. In fact, East Asia has quite a lot of powers there, because you have in various forms and shapes, Japan, South Korea, Indonesia, Malaysia, all these, Vietnam lately. So the idea of America first and America only, I think it's going to be a big challenge, because the European powers are declining, but they are not like dropping from where they are suddenly. We have the Gulf states, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Israel itself, Turkey. These are Gulf states that have become powers, Russia and so forth. So this suggests that we are going to be in the multipolar world for quite a while. And in fact, let me just illustrate this with the example of East Africa. The Gulf states of United Arab Emirates, where Dubai is based, and Qatar and Saudi Arabia are now some of the major powers in terms of investment in Kenya, in Tanzania. They actually compete in Uganda and in Ethiopia, in Somalia. They are competing effectively with the Chinese, as it were. So I think that then suggests the second point, which also has been a subject of heavy discussion, that indeed the American power is declining. And this idea of America first is a kind of reaction to the fact that the American power is also reducing. Because in fact, you see the Chinese now are doing heavy trade with Latin American countries, which is on the doorsteps of the US. They are also available in the Caribbean and so forth. So I think the US is struggling with the fact that it's no longer the main manufacturing power. Its economy is based on debt. It has an aging population. Although, again, it remains a power, but it sees its power declining. On the basis of that, this is why I think I'm convinced that South Africa should not necessarily take a radical approach, as I've seen some colleagues of mine suggest in the Q&A, that we should just tell the Americans that we are a sovereign nation and that we should they should not dictate to us and so forth. Rather, you see, I'll conclude with this point, with this view. I think we can take the approach that China took in the late 70s when it was a very weak country. In fact, it was in a worse state than many African countries. They decided that we will bide our time. We will take a low profile, develop ourselves in terms of manufacturing capacity, in terms of education skills and so forth, and then emerge slowly. This is 40 years later. China is now a power, having implemented those ideas, rather than saying, no, look, we're going to be combative and fight out there. I think that's my kind of sense on this. Thank you. You're muted. You're muted.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say that before you leave, Doc, I would like you to respond to this very briefly, just because you've somehow highlighted it. One last question in the chat that we'll tackle. Lesotho responded to the tariffs by giving Starlink a license. Is this a reflection of South Africa's lack of power in its sphere of influence? At this rate, the US may establish a listening post in Lesotho, with Pretoria not having a say. What is your comment?
It's a tricky one. And I think I'll tell you with the other thing that first, everybody has grasped the fact that Trump is a transactionalist, if there's any such word, in the sense that he looks at a situation and figures out if there's any leverage based on the factors at play. I think this is the angle that Lesotho has taken, that we're going to suffer immensely, and South Africans are not going to come to our salvage, particularly because they are reliant on textiles, and they have been hammered with, I think, something like about 18% tariff. Now, that can also be applied to the matter of the ICJ. I've seen a comment from a colleague there suggesting that we should use ICJ as a leverage to negotiate, to say, we are going to withdraw from ICJ and therefore negotiate with the US and Israel. I don't think, on some of those matters, I think South Africa should maintain the high moral ground. In any case, it has already taken a position, and it will be terrible to take a step back, to backpedal on its moral kind of best approach to its foreign policy. And I think that also then applies to, in fact, the whole point of Elon Musk claiming that Starlink is not operational in South Africa because they have been because of the anti-white kind of sentiment. I think the South African government has clarified very clearly that Starlink has not applied for a license, and that the South Africa demands that every company plays by its rules and regulations. So my view is that South Africa should maintain that even as it negotiates. I don't think negotiating means, giving up some of your, ethical morally bound kind of standpoints. For example, you cannot just say, let's walk back on a regulation that requires all foreign companies to register so that we are in the good graces of the US government. I think there must be some red lines that you cannot cross. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, we're coming to the end of our webinar. There's been a lot to unpack, and I think we need to be having more of such enriching discussions. But before we go, I would just like to offer this under just maybe a minute or two before I invite Lerato from the Alumni Relations Office to give us our final words. Our speakers, just your final reflections, 1 minute, 2 minutes, one question. We've talked a lot about the challenges that this Trump administration in particular is bringing for South Africa-US relations. What opportunities do you see for the next 4 years for South Africa and perhaps Africa? Is there anything positive to speak about, or are we just going to keep saying, oh gosh, Trump for the next 4 years? Dr.
Maybe the opportunity, yes. Thank you, Doc, for steering this ship so well. Perhaps the greatest opportunity for Africans in general, through our own governments, it's a perilous moment of reflection. A very senior politician was talking to me last week. She reminded me that in 1945, President Nkrumah and his contemporaries met, and they were talking about how you mustn't lose sight of the liberation, the commitment to the liberation of Africa. And then she says to me, it took 49 years for South Africa to realize that. And why was she making that point? Until Africans themselves not only talk about, the African unity in more superficial ways, but begin to realize moments such as these are calling them to unite. That's what I was going to be saying. As for South Africa, they must continue working on that. I still believe on diplomacy, by the way, and soft power. I know that there are many critics of it, but I'm saying what's the alternative, especially when you're dealing with a superpower like the United States? And it's important for South Africa to continuously lobby the rest of the continent. I still think some of our solutions can come from there. Of course, the advantages of having BRICS can help us to move forward. But we will be watching the space, not only the next 4 years, Doc, but just the rest of 2025 on its own. How will G20 unfold? 4 years feels like a very long time. I'll be watching 2025. I'm going to take it month by month, and then 1 month to the year, because 4 years is quite a long time. Thank you so much for having me. I've enjoyed this discussion so much.
Thank you. Dr. Wekesa, your last point, 1 minute, opportunities that this Trump presidency presents for South Africa, Africa broadly.
No, exactly. I mean, it is quite interesting that it has taken Trump for us to realize how exposed and vulnerable we are to the US. In fact, not just South Africa, but the rest of the continent. But in the same breath, it will be important that South Africans and Africans more broadly take advantage of this to kind of reconsider areas where we are dependent on a foreign power. I mean, if your budget for your health budget is dependent on another country and they want to use it to hit you, then indeed you are very vulnerable. And of course, then the old notion of South African agency, meaning that you can actually do a couple of things based on the current situation to increase your capacity in various ways: internal trade, increase of manufacturing, value addition to products, living within your means budgetary wise, and just essentially saying, look, we can accept aid, but not in certain sectors. We have to be self-sufficient, in some respects. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I would like to hand over to the Wits Alumni Relations Office, Lerato.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Kabwe. Hi, everybody. My name is Lerato Mtambanengwe. I'm the liaison officer at the Wits Alumni Relations Office. I would like to give a huge thanks to our discussants and our moderator, Dr. Wekesa, Dr. Ngcetane-Vika, and Dr. Kabwe, for today's highly insightful discussion. Thank you for taking out the time in your day to chat with us today and have this really very important conversation with us. A special thank you to the African Center for the Study of the United States for partnering with us on this conversation. And everyone, all our guests, if you haven't done so yet, please follow the African Center for the Study of the US, the Wits School of Governance, Wits Alumni Relations, and Wits University on all the different platforms. Also follow the speakers. I have put links in the chat for their books and the LinkedIn profiles and everything. So please do follow where you can. I would also like to acknowledge and thank our Alumni Relations Director, Mr. Peter Ma, for his guidance behind the scenes. And last, but certainly not least, I would like to thank each and every one of you for joining us today from different corners of the world. Thank you so, so much for joining us. The recording of this webinar will be available on the Wits Alumni Relations YouTube channel. A link will be shared. As long as you've registered, you will receive a link that will be, so please just look out on the emails for that. And we hope to see you at our next webinar. Thank you all. Keep calm and please look after yourselves. Have a lovely day further. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.